No, we are not making shoulder-fired rocket launchers today. However, rear end coolers and universal mounting solutions are on the menu. So I need to mount my rear end cooler. Some people prefer to mount the heat exchanger part somewhere on the chassis and then run the lines to it. I like to mount the cooler right to the rear end. This makes plumbing my lines shorter and everything moves in unison with the rear end, which reduces stress on the lines and breakage. I'm making these universal bolt-on mounts for the cooler because I can't use my regular weld-on ones because of where the suspension mounts are located and the frame is in the way. The whole cooler had to be slid over. These also give me the flexibility to move or remove the cooler if not needed. So the axle tube is 3 inches outside diameter, and the DOM tubing I'm making the clamps out of is 3 3/8 with a 1/875 or 3/16 wall thickness, which gives me a 3-inch inside diameter. Now this tubing isn't cheap. I think I paid about 22 bucks a foot for it, and I normally buy 4 feet. Even if you only bought 1 foot of it, that's still enough material to make 11 1-inch clamps. But you can make them as wide as you need depending upon what you're attaching to it. I'm making mine a tad over 1 inch. Let's call it 1 1/16 inches. I'm using 1/2-inch bolts for this project. So I have this 3/4 inch by 120 wall DOM tubing that I'll cut 2 pieces to 1 7/8 long. Now the fun part, weld prep. You can MIG or TIG these. I've done it both ways. For this job, MIG will do. Definitely make sure you grind the mill scale off the tubes before welding. This is optional, but if you want your 3/4 inch tubing to sit flatter to the large ring, grind a small radius in the center of the tubing. I've got my Multimatic 220 AC/DC auto set to 1/8 inch, and then I fine-tune the voltage and the wire feed speed to max. Warning: read and follow all labels and your owner's manuals. That's hot. Once they've cooled down, run them through the bandsaw and cut them in half. To avoid having an IKEA moment when I go to reassemble them, I like to punch mark one side. I'm testing this on my rear end mock-up tube so I can measure the clamp gap when it's tight. This is the same 3-inch tube diameter that's on the quick change rear end. Since my bandsaw blade is pretty thin, my gap measures only a 32nd of an inch. We need to grind the cut edge a little bit more on both pieces. My goal is to have about 1/16 to a max 3/32 of an inch gap when assembled on the tube. Let's check it out now. Oh yeah, that's a healthy 1/16. Looks good to me. These clamps are super strong, and you can make them as wide as you want. I've made them for coilover shock mounts, brake calipers, and even track bar mounts. And 3 and 4 inch wide ones with double mounting bolts for lower control arms. If you have an application where you have tons of rear bite and you're worried about clamp slippage, a couple short welds on the top and bottom of the clamp should be sufficient. To attach my cooler to the clamp, I've laid out this mount design on some 1x2 by 083 square tubing and a 14 gauge tray with a 1/2 inch lip bent into it to eliminate flex of the mount. So I'm using a 3¼ inch carbide hole saw to cut the radius out for this mount. I know what you're thinking. I already told you that I'm using a 3 3/8 diameter tube for the clamp. But I prefer the 3¼ inch hole saw because it gives me a little extra material here to fine tune the fit and a fudge factor for drill press variances, which is a nice way to say slop. Alright, so that's why you use a one size smaller hole saw. I got a little bit of minor fit up to do with it. I'm TIG welding the mount to the clamp. It could be MIG welded, but this is an easy TIG job. I'm using 1/16 ER70 S2 filler metal, and I'm on TIG steel with the Multimatic 220 AC/DC auto set to 1/8 inch, which I'm managing with the wireless foot control. Now, with a quick hit of the trigger, I'm MIG welding the mounting tray with the machine auto set to 16 gauge. For the clamp, I'm using 2.5 by 1/2 inch bolts and nylocks or regular lock nuts for final assembly. But for now, I'm just using the standard nuts. I don't recommend welding a lock nut to the mount, especially if it's going to be adjusted or removed often. This could cause the bolts to loosen up over time as the lock nut wears out. That'll work nicely. Next time on Real Garage, we're doing a product review for some long distance welding and a cool project to cure some headaches.